Metzora, Parsha 28, person afflicted with Zorat, is Vayikra 14:1 through 15:33. Adonai said to Moshe, "This is to be the law concerning the person afflicted with Zorat at the day of his purification. He is to be brought to the Kohen, and the Kohen is to go outside the camp and examine him there. If he sees that the Zorat sores have been healed in the afflicted person, then the Kohen will order that 2 living clean birds be taken for the one to be purified, along with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop leaves. The Kohen is to order one of the birds slaughtered in a clay pot over running water. As for the live bird, he is to take it with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and dip them in the living bird in the blood of the bird slaughtered over the running water, and sprinkle the person to be purified from the Zorat 7 times. Next he is to set the live bird free in an open field. He who is purified must wash his clothes, shave off his hair, and bathe himself in water. Then he will be clean. After that he may enter the camp, but he must live outside the tent for 7 days. On the 7th day he shall shave all his hair off his head, so his beard and his beard and his eyebrows. He must shave off all his hair, and he is to wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and he will be clean. On the 8th day he is to take 2 male lambs without defect, 1 female lamb in its first year without defect, and 6 1/2 quarts of fine flour for a grain offering, mixed with olive oil, and 2/3 of a pint of olive oil. The Kohen purifying him is to place the person being purified with these items before Adonai at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The Kohen is to take one of the male lambs and offering it as a guilt offering with 2/3 pint of olive oil, then wave as a wave offering before Adonai. He is to slaughter the male lamb at the place of the sanctuary for slaughtering sin offerings and burnt offerings, because the guilt offering belongs to the Kohen, just like the sin offering. It is especially holy. The Kohen is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Next, the Kohen is to take some of the 2/3 pint of olive oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand, dip his right finger in that oil that is in his left hand, and sprinkle from the oil with his finger 7 times before Adonai. Then the Kohen is to put some of the remaining oil in his hand, on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big foot of his right foot, or big toe of his right foot, and on the blood of the guilt offering. Finally, the Kohen is to put the rest of the oil in his hand on the head of the person being purified, and the Kohen will make atonement for him before Adonai. Then the Kohen is to offer the sin offering and make atonement for the person being purified because of his uncleanness. Afterwards, he is to slaughter the burnt offering. The Kohen is to offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for him, and he will be clean. If he is poor, so that he can't afford to do otherwise, he is to take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering to be waved to make atonement for him, 2 quarts of the fine flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, 2/3 of a pint of olive oil, and 2 doves, or 2 young pigeons, such as he can afford. The one is for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. On the 8th day he will bring them to the Kohen for his purification, to the entrance of the tent of meeting before Adonai. The Kohen is to take the lamb of the guilt offering and the 2/3 of a pint of olive oil and wave them as a wave offering before Adonai. He is to slaughter the lamb of the guilt offering, and the Kohen is to take some of the blood of the guilt offering and put it on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. The Kohen is to take some of the olive oil and pour it into the palm of his own left hand, and sprinkle with his right hand some of the oil that is in his left hand 7 times before Adonai. The Kohen is to put some of the oil in his hand on the tip of the right ear of the person being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, on the big toe of his right foot. In the same place as the blood of the guilt offering. Finally, the Kohen is to put the rest of the oil in his hand on the head of the person being purified, to make atonement for him before Adonai. He is to offer 1 of the doves or young pigeons, such as a person can afford, whatever his means suffice for. The one is a sin offering, and the other is a burnt offering. And with the grain offering, thus the Kohen will make atonement before Adonai for the person being purified. Such is the law for the person who has Zorat sores, if he cannot afford the usual elements used for his purification. Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, When you have entered the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as a possession, and I put an infection of Zerat in a house in the land that you possess, then the owner of the house is to come and tell the Kohen, "It seems to me that there may be an infection in the house." The Kohen is to order the house emptied before he goes in to inspect the infection, so that everything in the house won't be made unclean. Afterwards, the Kohen is to enter and inspect the house. He will examine the infection, and if he sees that the infection is in the walls of the house, with greenish or reddish depressions that there seem to go deeper than the surface of the wall, he is to go out of the house to its doors and seal up the house for 7 days. The Kohen will come again on the 7th day and examine the house. If he sees that the infection has spread over its walls, he is to order them to remove the infected stones and throw them into some unclean place outside the city. Next, he is to have the inside of the house thoroughly scraped and the scraped off plaster is to be discarded outside the city in an unclean place. Finally, other stones must be set in the place of the first stones and the plaster used to replace the house. If the infection returns and breaks out in the house after the stones have been removed and the house scraped and plastered, then the Kohen is to enter and examine it. If he sees that the infection has spread in the house, it is a contagious zerat in the house, it is unclean. He must break down the house, take its stones, timber, and plaster out of the city to an unclean place. Moreover, whoever enters the house at any time while it is sealed up will be unclean until evening. Whoever lies down or eats in the house must wash his clothes. If the Kohen enters, examines, and sees that the infection has not spread in the house since it was plastered, then he is to declare the house clean, because the infection is cured. To purify the house, he is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop leaves. He is to slaughter one of the birds in a clay pot over running water. He is to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet yarn, and the live bird, and dip them in the blood of the slaughtered bird, and in the running water. Sprinkle the house 7 times. He will purify the house with the blood of the bird, the running water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. But he is to set the live bird free outside the city in an open field. Thus will he make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. Such is a law for all kinds of zors for a crusted area. For a zerat in a garment, for a house, for a swelling, for a scab, and for a bright spot, to determine when it is clean, when it is unclean. This is a law concerning zerat. Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, "Tell the people of Israel, when any man has a discharge from his body, the discharge is unclean. The discharge is unclean no matter whether it continues flowing or has stopped. It is still his uncleanness. Every bed which the person with a discharge lies in is unclean, and everything he sits on is unclean. Whoever touches his bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Whoever sits on anything the person with a discharge sat on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Anyone who touches the body of the person with a discharge is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with a discharge spits on someone who is unclean, the latter is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any saddle that the person with the discharge rides on will be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him will be unclean until evening. He who carries those things is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with the discharge fails to rinse his hands in water before touching someone, that person is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. If the person with the discharge touches a clay pot, it must be broken. If he touches a wooden utensil, it must be rinsed in water. When a person with a discharge has become free of it, he is to count 7 days for his purification. Then he is to wash his clothes, bathe his body in running water. After that he will be clean. On the 8th day he is to take for himself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, come before Adonai to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the Kohen. The Kohen is to offer them. The one is a sin offering and the other is a burnt offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for him on account of his discharge before Adonai. If a man has a seminal emission, he is to bathe his entire body in water. He will be unclean until evening. Any clothing or leather on which there's any semen is to be washed with water. It will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with a woman, has sexual relations, both are to bathe themselves in water. They will be unclean until evening. If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she will be in her state of nidah for 7 days. Whoever touches her will be unclean until evening. Everything she lies on or sits on in her state of nidah will be unclean. Whoever touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He won't be unclean until evening. Whoever touches anything she sits on is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. He will be unclean until evening. As soon as he touches the bed or something she sat on, he will be unclean until evening. If a man goes to bed with her and her menstrual flow touches him, he will be unclean 7 days, and every bed he lies on will be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not during her period, or if her discharge lasts beyond the normal end of her period, then throughout the time she is having an unclean discharge, she will be as when she is in nidah. She is unclean. Every bed she lies on at any time while she is having her discharge will be for her like the bed she uses during the time of her nidah, and everything she sits on will be unclean, with uncleanness like the time of her time of nidah. Whoever touches those things will be unclean. He is to wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and he will be unclean until evening. If she has become free of her discharge, she is to count 7 days. After that, she will be clean. On the 8th day, she is to take for herself 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the Kohen at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The Kohen is to offer the one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering. Thus the Kohen will make atonement for her before Adonai on account of her unclean discharge. In this way you will separate the people of Israel from their uncleanness, so they will not die in a state of uncleanness for defiling my tabernacle, which is there with them. Such is a law for the person who has a discharge, for the man who has a seminal emission that makes him unclean, for the woman in nidah during her menstrual period, for the person, man or woman, with a discharge, and for the man who has sexual relations with a woman who is unclean.